A widowed settler was abandoned with newborn triplets, until struggling widower Cowboy saved them from the snow. The morning after thunder did not rise with color. It crept, pale and breathless, across the plains, where winter's last fingers still clutched the ground in brittle frost. Smoke rose in lazy, uncertain threads from the crooked chimney of a homestead half-swallowed by prairie grass. The wind, restless and lean, dragged the scent of wet ash across the silence. And within that silence, a different sound entirely. A sound the world had no name for. 3 newborns crying in a cabin built for 4. Mabel sat on the floor, her back pressed against the bedpost, knees drawn to her chest, her dress damp with sweat and milk and something like sorrow. She did not move quickly, nor slowly, but with the care of someone who had learned that suddenness could break things. The babies were swaddled in shirts that no longer belonged to anyone. She had torn them from the trunk last night, cut them with shaking hands. Her stitching was uneven. She would fix it later, maybe. Maybe not. One child had red in its face when it cried. Another barely made a sound. The third stared at the ceiling beams, with dark eyes too old for a morning like this. Mabel didn't speak to them. Her voice had been given to the night before, when she'd whispered to her husband's wooden cross long after the lantern burned out. There hadn't been much to say, really. Just names. And please. And don't leave yet. But he had. Not in the way the world leaves. In the way fire leaves a matchstick. For days ago, he had been full of cough and fever and determination. A man whose boots still carried purpose even as his hands trembled. She had kept him warm, fed him broth, rubbed his chest with tallow and prayer. But the prairie did not listen. The prairie was too old to care. He died with his hand outstretched, not reaching for her, but for something in the corner of the room that only the dying can see. She did not scream. Screaming was for people who believed it might change something. The babies came 2 days later, one after the other, like rain beginning. She bore them alone, not because she wanted to, but because there was no one else. And now it was morning. She looked at the child nearest her knee. It had fallen asleep with its hand curled in a tiny fist, resting against the collar of the shirt she had worn on her wedding day. The lace was stained with afterbirth and the sweat of labor, but she could still see where the buttons used to be, mother of pearl, small as a fingernail. She reached to smooth the baby's hair, but pulled back before touching it. The gesture felt too final, like closing a chapter she wasn't ready to end. The door creaked open without ceremony. She didn't flinch. A man stood there, tall, broad in the shoulders, wrapped in a wool coat that still held flakes of road dust. He removed his hat. His face was rough, square-jawed, older than it used to be. Jedediah Clark, her husband's older brother. He looked at her, then at the babies, and then at the fire that had gone out sometime in the early hours. His mouth twitched. Not quite pity, not quite guilt. "I heard," he said, and that was all. She nodded once. Words were costly this morning. "I can take the horses," he offered, "and send for someone. A nurse maybe, or the bishop's wife. You can't stay out here. Not alone with all that." She did not look up. Instead, she picked up a nearby log, split it with a practiced hand, and dropped it into the hearth. "They're mine," she said, "and this is my house." Jed shifted his weight. His boots scraped against the threshold. "Mabel," he said gently, "you can't live on stubborn." She rose slowly, her back sore, her ribs aching from the weight of giving life. Her eyes met his. They were not hard, just exhausted beyond hardness. "Then I'll die on it." He opened his mouth again, but the wind outside picked up, and with it came the cold truth of a man who knows when he's lost. He turned, murmured something she didn't catch, and walked away. She watched him go through the crooked window, saw how he hesitated at the edge of the clearing before mounting his horse. The animal snorted, impatient. He rode off without looking back. The silence returned, but it was not the same. It carried judgment now. Or perhaps it was pride. Mabel sat back down. Her knees creaked. The middle child stirred and whimpered. She pressed her palm softly over the baby's chest, feeling the flutter of breath beneath her skin. So small, so alive. Each heartbeat was a defiance. She hadn't named them yet. It didn't feel right, naming something in a world where names could be carved on crosses before anyone learned the sound of them. Outside, the wind rattled the shutters. Somewhere in the distance, a hawk cried, its voice high and lonely. The sky was beginning to clear, but the sun refused to shine with any conviction. The light remained shy. Her eyes drifted to the shelf near the door. A tin of flour, a bit of salt, dwindling supplies. She'd eat a trap or trade soon, maybe go as far as the mission town. But the road was long, and the babies needed more than she could carry. Still, she didn't allow herself the weight of worry. Not now. Not yet. She stood, stretched her arms above her head, and winced as something pulled in her back. Her dress hung loose where it once hugged her. The mirror across the room reflected a woman she barely recognized. Pale, thin, eyes like cooled ash. But there was something else in her expression. Not fire, not even ice. Granite. From behind, a gurgle, a hiccup, the smallest laugh from the child with the quietest lungs. Mabel turned slowly. The sound was fragile as a spider's thread, but it caught her. She knelt, drew the child close, and let her face rest against its forehead. The baby smelled of milk and earth. She closed her eyes and breathed deep. For a moment, nothing hurt. The door was shut now. The latch barely held, but it would. The fire would need coaxing, but she still had twigs. And if the snow came again, she'd pile blankets high and hold the babies close, skin to skin. A heartbeat was warmer than wool. Evening would come, just like the last. And maybe another man. Or maybe not. But the babies would sleep, and she would keep watch. That was her vow. Not with a ring. Not with ceremony. With blood. With breath. Outside, the wind quieted. The prairie exhaled. And inside that small house, wrapped in stitched shirts and silence, for hearts beat on. Not loud, but steady. The trail he followed was older than any map, carved by hooves and hardship, not intention. It wound through the lowland scrub and tall, golden grasses, curling like smoke across the open belly of the west. There was no destination in his mind, only motion, a kind of forwardness that kept him breathing. Caleb Boone rode hunched in the saddle, his coat stained with dust, his hat brim pulled low to shade eyes that had forgotten how to be young. The horse beneath him was lean and half lame from a thrown shoe weeks back, but it kept on without complaint. They were alike in that way. The sun was high but didn't offer warmth. It watched indifferent as man and beast passed beneath it, as if neither belonged to the living world anymore. Caleb's hands were cracked, his fingernails rimmed in the dark half-moons of old soil. Tied behind him was a small pack, a tin cup, a carving knife, a journal with no new words. The pages had stopped some time after she did. His wife's name was Eleanor. He hadn't spoken it aloud in months. Saying it felt like opening a door that only led to smoke. 2 winters had passed since he buried her. A fever took her in 3 days, quick and cruel. She'd been soft-spoken, always braiding her hair to the left, humming hymns while she worked. They hadn't had children, though they tried. He used to think there was something wrong with her, then came to understand the failure was his. After she died, there was no one to ask forgiveness from. Only the prairie, and it didn't speak. He kept moving after that, drifted from town to town, ranch to ranch. He built fences, broke wild horses, shared coffee with men who spoke only when it was necessary. He wasn't a recluse by nature, but grief made a quiet man quieter, the kind of quiet that wrapped around your bones like cold iron. He was heading north now, toward a settlement he didn't recall the name of, only that someone told him there was work. Fences again, or irrigation trenches. It didn't matter. Work was a form of prayer. As dusk softened the edge of the world, he saw the smoke, not from a cooking fire or a chimney kept for warmth. This was darker, disorganized, a kind of accidental smudge against the sky. It drew his eye like blood and water. He paused on the ridge, horse breathing heavy beneath him. Far below, cabin sat alone, its roof patchy, the nearby barn half leaning like a man caught mid-stagger. The smoke came from the chimney, but not with rhythm. Something about it felt desperate. He did not want to turn down that hill. He did. The hooves sounded too loud as he approached, crunching frostbitten grass and stirring birds from the trees. No sound came from the cabin itself. The porch was bare. One shutter hung by a single hinge, clicking against the siding in the wind like an old metronome. He dismounted and tied the reins loosely to the fence. The gate was broken. He stepped over it and knocked once on the warped door, more out of habit than necessity. No answer. He opened it gently. The inside smelled of smoke and something raw, the earthy scent of birth not long past. The room was dim, lonely by the pale wedge of sunlight falling through the cracked window. In its glow he saw her, a woman slumped against the wall. Her hair stuck to her cheeks, her dress rumpled and damp. She held something against her chest, a baby, he realized, no bigger than a sack of potatoes. Behind her, on a makeshift bed, lay two more, their cries soft, exhausted. The woman blinked up at him, eyes sharp even through the fog of weariness. "You with the bishop?" she asked, voice dry as split bark. He shook his head. "Just passing." She studied him, one brow twitching, as if calculating whether that was a threat. "If you come to take them," she said, "I'll put a skillet through your skull." He lifted his hand slowly. "Ain't here for that." Her gaze lingered another heartbeat before she nodded once, barely. He stepped inside. The hearth was dying. A few cinders blinked red in the ash, but no flame. He crossed the room, crouched, and began to rebuild the fire. He did it without asking, without words. The baby in her arms whimpered, and she shifted it against her collarbone. "Triplets," he said quietly. She made no reply. When the fire caught, he stood and turned. Her eyes followed him like a hunting dog's, cautious, keen. "You got names for him?" he asked. Her jaw set. "Not yet." He nodded, as if that made perfect sense. The silence stretched between them, not heavy, but taut. He didn't try to fill it. Instead, he looked around. Sparse supplies. The table bore a cracked bowl of dried beans, a kettle cold. He could see now the line of fatigue etched into her cheeks, the tightness around her mouth. A woman who had spent her last ounce of strength and was somehow still standing. He stepped to the door. "I'll bring in wood." She didn't stop him. There was a pile out back, but most of it was damp. He gathered what he could, returned, stacked it beside the fire. She pulled a blanket over one of the babies, whose face had flushed red with crying. The others were quiet. He filled the kettle with the bit of water left in the barrel and set it to boil. She watched him do all of this without a word, her expression unreadable. "You got a name?" she asked at last. He hesitated before answering. "Caleb." She nodded. "Mabel." They did not shake hands. As the fire grew, the room warmed. The children stopped crying one by one, as if even their small bodies knew they had to conserve what little they had. Caleb moved to the corner and lowered himself onto the stool. It creaked beneath his weight. "You got anyone coming?" he asked. Her mouth quirked, something like a smile, but without any joy. "Only folks who've come so far have had opinions, not help." He didn't press further. The kettle began to steam. He poured water into 2 tin mugs, one for her, one for himself, though she didn't reach for hers. "I lost someone," he said, after a long time. Her eyes flickered to his. 2 years back," he continued. "Fever like a match to paper." She didn't respond, but something in her body loosened, like a door cracking open just enough to see through. "It's not the dying," she murmured. "It's the part after, when the doing don't stop, but the reason for it's gone." He nodded once, slow. They sat in silence again, a quieter one this time. Not taut, just tired. Outside, the wind began to shift. He could hear it turning in the trees, bringing the smell of frost and something wetter, heavier. Maybe snow. "I'll fix that shutter tomorrow," he said, rising. "You don't have to stay," she replied, but there was no steel in her voice, only weariness. "I know," he said. He took the stool and laid out his coat, sat against the far wall, letting the fire warm his boots. He would sleep sitting up. Done it before. The baby stirred, sighed, and settled. Mabel leaned her head back, and in a few minutes, her breathing changed. He didn't sleep. Not yet. There was something about this cabin. Not the shape of it. Not the smell, or the woman, or the silence. Something older. A familiarity he couldn't name. Like a book he'd read long ago and forgotten, until he stumbled upon the same story again, written in someone else's hand. He didn't know what he was doing here, but for the first time in a long time, not knowing didn't feel like drifting. It felt like maybe he was being led by something quiet and unshouted. The wind sighed around the eaves. He closed his eyes, just for a moment. Spring came slow and stubborn, like a man returning home after years on the road. The snow melted in hesitant patches, revealing earth hardened by grief and seasons. The wind no longer howled but hummed, and in that soft sound was something like permission to mend, to grow, to begin again, if only in inches. Caleb repaired the porch first. Not because it mattered much, the babies weren't walking, and Mabel rarely left the cabin, but because he needed something to put his hands on, something to fix without asking how. The boards had buckled and sagged through winter, warped by wet and neglect. He cut new planks from an old pine tree behind the barn and sanded them until they were smooth as bone. Each nail driven into place was a heartbeat. Each swing of the hammer a breath he didn't know he was holding. Mabel watched from the window, a baby at her breast, another curled in a sling across her chest. She said nothing of the work, offered no praise. But once, as he passed by the door with his sawdust-covered coat, she handed him a mug of water, her fingers brushing his knuckles. It was the first time she'd touched him. Inside, the cabin breathed differently now. The fire stayed lit. The floor was swept. Diapers hung from a line Caleb rigged by the hearth. He never complained about the smell, never flinched when a baby's cry pierced the stillness like a shot. Instead, he learned their rhythms, which child needed rocking, which liked to be held high, which one clutched fingers tight in sleep. They still had no names. He asked once, gently, as he held the smallest in his arms, the one with eyes that always seemed to follow light. "Not ready," Mabel said, folding a shirt she'd mended. "Not till I know they're staying." He didn't ask what she meant. He knew. There was no courtship between them, no blushing glances or stolen moments. What grew between them grew in silence. It lived in shared tasks, drawing water, boiling rice, wiping chins, changing cloths. There were no vows, but he began to sleep indoors, on the floor at first, near the hearth. One night she nodded to the cot in the corner, and he moved there without comment. Sometimes she woke screaming. Her dreams were not loud, but they tore her from sleep with the violence of memory. Caleb never spoke when it happened. He simply rose, poured water into a chipped cup, and waited. She'd drink with trembling hands, then lie back down without a word. In the morning, she would rise first and boil oats as if nothing had cracked in the night. Once, after such a night, she sat beside him on the porch. The babies napped inside, and the breeze was warm with the scent of drying grass. "I wasn't always like this," she murmured, staring at the hills. "I reckon none of us were," he said. She nodded slowly. "He was good. My husband. Good to me. But he never saw me like this. Like I could hold something broken and keep it from falling apart." Caleb didn't speak. The sun moved across his boots. "I thought I'd shatter," she continued, quieter now. "When I lost him. When I gave birth without anyone. I thought if I close my eyes, I won't wake again." Her voice didn't break. It didn't need to. Her stillness said enough. "But you did wake," he said. "You kept waking. I don't know why. Maybe because they needed you to." She looked at him then. Not past him. Not through him. At him. "Maybe," she said. After that, things began to shift. He started calling the babies by little names, not proper ones, just soft sounds. Button. Whisper. Buckeye. Mabel never corrected him. Once she smiled. He taught her to shoot a pistol, slow and careful, her hands too small for the grip, but her aim steady. She taught him to bake bread that didn't turn to stone. On one afternoon, they both laughed, truly laughed, when the middle child wriggled free from the swaddle and peed straight into the air like a fountain. They never spoke of the future, but it crept in anyway, like wildflowers pushing through split stone. Then, one afternoon, a man returned. Jedediah rode in hard from the east, his boots dusted with the trail, a bottle tucked beneath his coat. Caleb was chopping wood and saw him before Mabel did. He said nothing, just stood still and waited. Jed dismounted, stretched, and looked around with casual ownership. He saw the repaired porch, the smoke rising steady. The swing Caleb had hung from the tree. "Well," he said, stepping forward, "looks like you made it cozy." Mabel appeared in the doorway, a baby in each arm. Jed tipped his hat, face half a smile. "You look better, Mabel. Real fine. Heard you got yourself a helper now." She didn't answer. The wind answered for her, rustling through the dry weeds. "I've been thinking," Jed said, stepping closer. "You could still come back with me. Bring the children. I got space. Got food. You wouldn't have to live like this, scraping by, patching roof holes." She stood still as fence post. Caleb didn't move. Jed looked at her for a long time, then let his eyes flick toward Caleb. "He doesn't look like much," he said. Mabel shifted her weight. Then, without raising her voice, she said, "He looks like someone who stays." The silence that followed was complete. Jed didn't argue. He didn't fight. He looked down, shrugged, and muttered something about bad timing. He rode off slower than he came. Caleb didn't speak, just went back to splitting wood. That night, Mabel named them. She did it without ceremony. No long speeches or stories. Just whispered the names into their ears as she laid them into bed. Jonah, Elia, Ruth. Caleb heard her from the other room, and something inside him softened further. Something he didn't know was still hard. Later, she joined him on the porch, a shawl around her shoulders, the wind light on her face. "I think I'm scared of peace," she said. "Why?" "Because it can be taken." He thought a long while before answering. "So can anything good. But that don't mean we don't take it when it's offered." She leaned her head on his shoulder. The stars above were quiet and different, but something sacred moved beneath them. The hush of two people learning not just how to survive, but how to begin. Neither of them said what they were becoming. They didn't need to. In the cradle inside, 3 small breaths rose and fell. The night smelled of wood smoke and wild mint. It wasn't much, but it was enough. The sky began to shift before the birds quieted. A strange hush settled over the prairie, not the peaceful kind, but the uneasy stillness of a world holding its breath. Clouds gathered without warning, thick, bruised things that rolled low and slow, turning the light to ash. Even the wind seemed to retreat, as if it too sensed something coming it didn't wish to meet. Caleb stood near the fence, hammer in hand, a length of rope slung over his shoulder. His eyes were trained on the horizon. It was the color of iron now, swollen with the promise of something more than rain. He watched the trees in the distance bow ever so slightly, not from wind, but from pressure, as if the land itself was bracing. He turned back toward the house, toward the cabin that had become a quiet cradle of the life they were building. Inside, Mabel rocked Ruth in her arms while Jonah and Elia dozed in the cradle Caleb had built months before, its corners now smoothed by use and soft touches. The room was dim despite the hour, and the fire already lit, unusual for early afternoon. "You feel it?" Caleb asked, voice low. Mabel didn't look up. Been feeling it since morning. The birds wouldn't come down to the trough. He nodded. "Storm's gonna sit right on top of us. Big one." She pressed her lips together. "You ever see one tear up a roof?" "Once. Back in Laramie. Took the whole front off a saloon like it was paper." Her hands tightened around Ruth's blanket. "I'll get the root cellar ready," he said. "You get what food you can carry. And blankets. We might be down there a while." She didn't argue. That was new. Mabel had learned the language of preparation, not from panic, but from having endured too much to dismiss warning signs. Her body moved on instinct now, just like his. While she packed satchels of beans, dried meat, water, and spare cloths, Caleb shored up the barn door, drove stakes deeper into the fence posts, and lashed extra rope over the roof. It was like trying to hold back the tide with cupped hands. But still, you did what you could. When he returned, she was tying Ruth to her chest, one of the boys slung across her back, the third asleep in her arms. She looked like a woman ready to walk through fire and keep going. You can't carry all three like that, he said, not unkindly. I'll manage, she replied. He stepped forward, slipping the sleeping boy from her arms without asking. We'll go together. They made it to the cellar just as the first crack of thunder split the sky open. The air turned electric, the smell of ozone sharp in their nostrils. Caleb yanked open the hatch and helped her down the narrow steps. The babies whimpered, unsure whether to cry or sleep. The root cellar was tight, not meant for people, but it held warmth and shelter. Shelves lined with canned peaches and dusty jars of pickled beets closed in around them. Caleb lit the lantern and set it between them, its glow casting shadows that danced like old ghosts across the stone walls. The storm hit in earnest then. It didn't roar, it howled, a monstrous, ceaseless sound like 1,000 wolves clawing at the sky. The earth shook beneath them, soft groans from beams overhead as the house above bore the brunt. Jonah began to cry, loud and confused. Mabel hushed him, rocking back and forth, but her voice broke, not from fear, but from sheer exhaustion. The moment cracked something between them, not a fracture, but a kind of opening. I thought I lost them once already, she whispered, eyes shimmering in the lantern light. That first night you came, I was bleeding, weak. I thought maybe I wouldn't make it till morning. He didn't speak, just reached across the narrow space and rested his hand lightly on her knee. I kept thinking, if I die, they'll starve. If I live, they'll still suffer. There's no right answer. There is, he said quietly. She looked at him. Wet strands of hair stuck to her cheeks. You lived, he said, and they're not suffering. Not anymore. The storm wailed louder, as if protesting that truth. Tears rolled freely down her face, the kind that didn't beg for comfort, just release. She let them fall, one by one, without apology. I didn't ask for this, she said, barely audible. I don't think anyone asks for the hard things, Caleb said. They just come. And then you decide what kind of person you'll be when they leave. She let the words sink in, her breathing slowing as the babies calmed, sensing her stillness. I'm tired, she said. I know. Not just tonight. All the way down into my bones. He nodded. Then lean, Mabel. You don't have to carry it all alone. And for the first time since he met her, she did. She leaned her head onto his shoulder, not out of romance, not out of need, but because something in her had finally allowed softness. He didn't move. He just breathed slow and steady, grounding them both. The storm screamed and shook the cellar door, but inside, something had quieted. When the worst had passed, when the wind slowed and the rain turned from violence to rhythm, they emerged. The land was changed. The barn roof had torn free, pieces scattered like straw across the grass. The porch he had built lay splintered near the path, and the small swing twisted from one rope like a ghost still clinging. But the cabin stood. Inside, the cradle was tipped, but the room held. The fire had gone out, but embers glowed. Mabel stepped in first, eyes scanning not for damage, but for memory. It held, she said softly, more to herself than him. It did. He began to clear the debris, wordless and precise. She gathered the babies into their blankets again, laying them close together on a rug as she fed them one by one. They were quiet now. Content. Later, as he nailed a loose shutter back into place, she stood beside him, arms crossed. You meant what you said down there? She asked. I did. She looked out toward the ruined porch, toward the place he'd spent hours shaping for a future that hadn't yet said its name. You ever want more? She asked. A family, a woman, a home. I thought I had it once, he said soft, but it died with her. She didn't look at him. So why'd you stay? Because I saw something in you, he said. Not broken, just brave. Her breath caught, not from shock, but recognition. I'm not brave. You don't have to believe it for it to be true. She turned to face him fully then, eyes no longer guarded. I don't know if I can love again. He didn't flinch. I'm not asking you to. He stepped closer, only slightly. But if you ever do, I'll be here. The wind rustled the grass behind them, quieter now, forgiving. The babies stirred in sleep, one letting out a small sigh that sounded like a dream. She nodded. Just once. That night, he moved his cot beside hers. They didn't touch. But when she woke in the dark, breath caught from another dream, she reached for his hand, and he let her find it. The porch stood again, not as it had before, not merely rebuilt, but transformed. Wider, with cedar railings smoothed to a polish by Caleb's calloused hands, a rocking bench long enough for two, and 3 tiny wooden chairs carved with care. It faced the open field like a declaration, catching every breeze, every sunrise. It was no longer just an extension of the house. It was the heart of it. A year had passed since the storm, and the land had softened around them. The harsh lines of winter had given way to tall grass and wildflowers, the kind Mabel sometimes picked and braided into her daughter's hair. The house bore marks of its age and survival, patched siding, a new chimney stone, soot stains that wouldn't scrub out. But there was beauty in its stubbornness. Jonah ran first, always the bold one. His boots barely touched the porch steps before he launched into the grass beyond, arms stretched wide as wings. Elia followed, careful but quick, toddling after his brother with a stubborn determination. Ruth stayed seated, palms pressed to the porch planks, watching the wind move through the fields like an invisible hand. Mabel leaned on the doorway, watching them. Her dress was faded but clean, her sleeves rolled, apron smeared with flour from the morning's bread. A loosened braid fell over one shoulder. There was a quiet strength in her now, the kind that didn't shout, didn't need recognition, just the kind that endured. Caleb stood beside her, hammer in hand, the final slat nailed into place. He stepped back, surveyed the porch as if seeing it for the first time. He wiped sweat from his brow and exhaled, a sound somewhere between fatigue and pride. "You think it'll hold?" she asked, teasing. He glanced at her, eyes crinkling. "I reckon it'll outlive us both." They watched the children play, a moment so simple it could be missed, but to them it felt like proof. Not that the worst was behind them, but that the good had taken root. The sound of hooves cracked the quiet. Mabel turned, her body tensing. Old instincts never fully left, not even in peace. A rider approached down the ridge. Dust trailed behind him. He didn't hurry, didn't slow. Caleb stepped off the porch, fingers brushing the handle of the axe still embedded in the chopping block. He didn't draw it. Not yet. The man was younger than Caleb, lean and sharp-eyed, with a rifle strapped across his back and a letter tucked into his vest pocket. He pulled up short, nodded once. "You Boone." Caleb nodded. "Message for you. From Salt Creek." Mabel stepped forward. "What kind of message?" The rider dismounted, pulled the folded letter from his coat, and handed it over. "Sheriff sent it. Said it might concern you." Caleb opened it, eyes skimming the paper, expression unreadable. Mabel watched him carefully. "What is it?" she asked. He folded the paper slowly, slipping it into his back pocket. "A man's been asking around, looking for a woman with triplets. Claims she's his. Claims he was away on business, and came back to find her gone." Her breath caught. "My husband's dead." "I know that," he said gently. The rider glanced between them. "Don't know if the man's lying, but he's coming this way. Might be a day behind." Mabel's jaw clenched, her voice hard. "I buried my husband with my own hands." Caleb stepped closer, resting a hand lightly on her shoulder. "We'll handle it. I'm not running. I'm not asking you to." The rider nodded once more, then mounted and turned back the way he came, leaving dust in his wake. Silence fell again, but it was different now, charged, alert. Inside the house, Ruth began to cry. Mabel turned instinctively, but Caleb touched her hand. "I'll get her." He entered, leaving her on the porch with the wind. That night, neither of them slept deeply. The moon hung low, swollen with warning. Caleb sat by the window, rifle across his lap, boots planted. Mabel lay in bed, the children between them. The room was quiet, but every gust of wind sounded like a step. Every creak of the roof could have been a saddle groaning. When dawn came, it brought more than light. A wagon rolled in just past the ridge. Not fast, not hidden. A man drove it, tall, sunburned, with a trimmed beard and a face that tried hard to look noble. He wore city clothes, worn from travel but still too fine for the dirt road. Caleb stepped onto the porch first. Mabel followed. The man stopped the wagon 20 yards out. He raised a hand. "I've come for my wife." Mabel didn't flinch. "You're mistaken." He smiled, but there was no kindness in it. "Your name's Mabel Walker. Married Henry Walker. He's not dead. He's me." "No," she said firmly. "Henry's buried 6 feet under in hard prairie dirt. I watched him go. Fever burned him hollow." He stepped down from the wagon, slowly, like a preacher descending from the pulpit. "I went east on business. Got held up by illness. When I returned, you were gone. I've been looking ever since. You're not him. You have no proof of that." Caleb stepped forward. "You don't look like someone who buried 3 infants and a husband." The man turned to him, eyes sharp. "And you are?" "Someone who's been here." The wind picked up. The babies began to cry from inside the house. Mabel stood taller. "Even if you were him," she said, voice shaking but strong, "you left me to die. You don't get to come back and claim anything." The man's smile dropped. "They're mine by blood or by marriage. They're mine by survival." He stepped forward, one hand twitching toward the wagon bed. Caleb saw it. The glint of metal, a pistol, just visible beneath a tarp. Mabel saw it too. Caleb didn't hesitate. He stepped in front of her. "No," he said. "You don't touch this house. You don't touch her. You don't take what you didn't fight for." The man froze, reading Caleb's stance. There was no bravado in it, no threat, just certainty. For a long moment, no one moved. The babies cried. The wind blew. Somewhere far off, a hawk shrieked overhead. The man stepped back. "Law's on my side." Caleb's eyes didn't waver. "So's God. Choose who you'd rather answer to." The man looked at Mabel one last time, not with longing, but with something uglier. Entitlement curdled by loss. Then he turned, mounted his wagon, and rode away. They stood there long after the dust settled. Caleb didn't speak. Mabel didn't breathe. When she finally did, it came as a sob, not of fear, of release. He turned and took her in his arms, and this time, she didn't hesitate. She let herself be held, not because she needed saving, but because she had survived long enough to be safe. Later, they sat on the porch. The babies giggled at their feet. The sun rose in earnest. The world, for once, had no argument. And love, not loud, not rushed, settled in like a long-awaited season. The porch creaked beneath them. It would hold.